There is something enigmatic about people who can change the environment without saying a word. They don't shout, they don't beg, they simply withdraw. And suddenly, everything changes. The climate changes, relationships change. Others begin to question themselves, to feel, to chase after. Have you noticed this? Carl Jung said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to a better understanding of ourselves. How? But he also knew something even more profound, that silence, when it comes from awareness, is not absence, it is heightened presence. We live in a world where being quick, responsive, and always available is a sign of virtue. Responding immediately, pleasing everyone, always being there, that's what's expected. But what if you broke that mold? What if, instead of reacting, you breathed? What if, instead of pleasing, you withdrew? What if, instead of seeking acceptance, you offered silence? Something extraordinary happens when you stop offering yourself all the time. The people who controlled you with their predictability go into crisis. Those who thought they knew you realize they never knew anything beyond your mask. And that's when the game changes. Because silence reveals what speech hides. And the question I leave you with today is simple but powerful. How much of your life is reaction, and how much is choice? You have been conditioned to always be available, emotionally, physically, mentally. But this constant availability is not love. It is emotional slavery disguised as virtue. It is self-abandonment disguised as kindness. And the most brutal truth, those who demand your presence the most often don't want you. They want what you offer: validation, companionship, emotional stability. But when you are silent, when you withdraw, not out of fear, but out of maturity, everything trembles. Everything is exposed. Everything is revealed. This video is about that, about the invisible power of silence, about the strength that arises when you decide not to react, about how conscious absence destabilizes narratives, breaks projections, and above all, reconnects you with what is rightfully yours, your energy, your peace, your inner sovereignty. So from now on, I invite you on a journey not of noise, but of depth, a journey towards the center of you, because it is in silence that true power begins to whisper. Persona, the mask of availability. From an early age, we learn that being loved means being useful, that being accepted means being approachable, and that keeping the peace means saying yes, even when everything inside us screams no. But Carl Jung already warned us, person, it is the social mask we wear to be accepted. And the more it is praised, the further we move away from who we really are. A person, it's not just the role we play at work, in our family, or in our friendships. It's the invisible filter that distorts our authenticity in exchange for emotional security. And between pleasing the world and being true to ourselves, we almost always choose to please, because saying no feels selfish, because disappearing feels like abandonment, because silence feels like rejection. But here is the truth that few can bear to look at. Constant availability is an elegant form of self-abandonment. You are helpful. You respond quickly. You are always there. But at what cost? Every message you respond to out of obligation is a small betrayal of yourself. Each forced presence is one more brick in the prison of person. Every smile that hides tiredness feeds the illusion that your value lies in how much you give, never in how much you preserve. And the cruelest thing? The mask of availability does not generate gratitude. It generates dependence, predictability. And everything that is predictable becomes a tool. It becomes a resource. It becomes an emotional emergency button. People squeeze you when they want attention, when they need comfort, when they want to feel important. And then what? They put you back on the shelf, as if you were nothing more than an emotional object. You don't realize it, but you're trapped in a persona. the understanding one, the trustworthy one, the one who's always there. And the more you behave like this, the less others see you as a person, and the more they treat you as a function. A person, it's a sophisticated scam. You believe it protects you, but it consumes you. It gives you recognition, but steals your essence. It brings you closer to people, but distances you from yourself. And the worst part, it's addictive. Because it's easier to be who others expect than to face the silence of being who you are. But Carl Jung knew and reminded us that the process of individuation requires the breakdown of person. Only when the mask cracks does the real me begin to breathe, and that moment is terrifying, but liberating. So take a look. When was the last time you said no and felt at peace? When was the last time you walked away and didn't blame yourself? When was the last time you breathed without feeling like you owed someone something? If you don't remember, maybe you've lived too long like person and less as a soul. It's time to start undoing this character, to uninstall the myth that being always available is proof of love. Because true love begins when you become available to yourself again. Psychic energy, your currency. Have you ever stopped to think how much an emotional reaction costs? An impulsive response, an unplanned outburst, an unnecessary explanation. Every little gesture you make to please, to be understood, to justify yourself, has a price. And that price is your psychic energy. For Jung, the human psyche is not a mechanical system. It is an energetic field. Every thought, emotion, and decision consumes something of you. And what few realize is that the greatest theft does not come from others, but from your own lack of awareness. You are running out of energy inside, not because your life is heavy, but because your energy is being spent where it shouldn't be. Replying to messages that drain you, sustaining conversations that don't nourish you, repeating explanations to people who never wanted to understand, defending yourself from criticism that doesn't even deserve your attention. Participating in relationships that exist out of habit, not connection. All this is an invisible waste of life force. And the scariest thing, most people don't realize this burnout. They just feel the result: chronic fatigue, apathy, anxiety. And they keep trying to compensate with more effort, more presence, more dedication, deepening the cycle of exhaustion even further. Carl Jung called this loss of psychic energy. He explained that the more you resist, the more you become attached to what hurts you. What you fight all the time imprisons you. Therefore, the problem is not just the other person, it is how much you react. Every time you respond on impulse, you are telling the world, here is a button that still works. And the world, opportunistic as it is, presses this button without mercy. Manipulative, emotionally needy, or simply unconscious people sense when you don't know how to protect your energy. They notice when you are too available, when you still try to save everything, solve everything, please everyone. And in this game, you always lose, because the more you try to maintain external control, the more you lose internal control. But there is a way out, and it starts with a change in attitude. Say no without guilt. Remain silent without feeling like a coward. Observe before acting, because true power is not in reaction, it is in choice. When you learn to save your energy, something changes. You no longer have to prove yourself. You no longer have to explain everything. You no longer have to be everywhere all the time. You become presence, not noise. You enter a room and your vibration speaks before any words. You become rare, because people who conserve their energy are rare, and everything that is rare is valuable. But to do this, you have to break the habit of responding. You have to endure the discomfort of not being understood. You have to resist the urge to explain yourself. And most importantly, you need to understand that not everyone deserves access to your energy. Because your energy is the most expensive currency you own. Spend wisely, invest consciously, protect with love. Because those who do not learn to control their own energy will be controlled by those who realize that you have not yet learned. Projections, the invisible theater of relationships. Most people you interact with aren't seeing you. They're seeing the image they've projected onto you, and that image, more often than not, has nothing to do with who you really are, but with what they need you to represent in order to keep the narrative they've built about themselves intact. That's why you feel so exhausted, even without knowing exactly why, because without realizing it, you spent your entire life trying to sustain roles you didn't choose, offering answers that didn't come from the heart, just so as not to disappoint, so as not to be misunderstood, so as not to be rejected by those who only know how to love when you are useful, understandable, predictable. Carl Jung called this projection the unconscious act of dumping onto others everything we cannot bear to see in ourselves. And, in this invisible theater of human relationships, you end up transforming yourself not into a whole person, but into an emotional mirror, which reflects the emptiness, fears, and insecurities of others as if they were your responsibility. You think you are being kind by giving in, by welcoming, by listening. But often you are just being manipulated by dynamics that were constructed without your consent. Dynamics where affection is conditioned, where your value depends on your role, where your silence is interpreted as coldness and your absence as guilt. And the cruelest thing about all this is that you learn to accept this theater as if it were love, as if it were genuine connection, as if it were care, when in fact, it is just the maintenance of an unconscious pact in which you give yourself in exchange for approval, in which you nullify yourself to maintain the emotional stability of someone who was never interested in your depth, only in your usefulness. But when you start to break away from that, when you stop reacting, when you stop explaining yourself, when you no longer accept the role of the savior, the available, the understanding, the system collapses, and what seemed like bonding turns out to be dependence, and what seemed like love turns out to be control. People start to get irritated, not because you have become a worse person, but because you have stopped fulfilling the emotional function that was convenient for them, because now you no longer fit the contours of their projection, because now you are a mystery, and that which cannot be controlled bothers. And it is at this moment that you realize the most difficult truth of all. Many have never related to you, only with the idea they created of you. And when that idea collapses, they don't know what to do. They don't know who you are without the role you fulfilled. They don't know how to relate to someone who has stopped accepting the role that was imposed on them. Jung said that we become conscious by making visible the darkness within, and this darkness often wears the mask of love, care, intimacy. But it is, in essence, a game of unconscious control, where the other person only loves you to the extent that you do not threaten their psychic stability. When you stop reacting, the game breaks. When you are silent, the masks fall. And that's where the shadows come to the surface. Not just other people's, but yours too. Because deep down, projection is only sustainable when there is someone willing to be the mirror. And as long as you identify with that role, you will remain a prisoner of it, believing you are being accepted, when in fact you are just being used. Withdrawing, then, is not indifference. It is maturity. Stopping reacting, justifying yourself, giving in, is not coldness. It is clarity. It is the awareness that your energy is too valuable to continue being shaped by the unconscious desires of others. When you stop acting, the theater ends, and it is only then that the truth begins. The silence as a psychological weapon. There is a kind of silence that is not absence, not indifference, not passivity. It is amplified presence. It is condensed power. It is a strategic refusal to continue playing the emotional game that others try to impose on you based on the invisible rules of urgency, immediate response, and the constant need for explanation. Carl Jung understood that the true process of individuation does not occur in the noise of social approval, but in the silence of inner listening, in voluntary withdrawal, in the firm decision to no longer react as before, no longer conform to the expectations of others, no longer justify oneself for being who one is, because it is in silence, and only in silence, that we begin to hear what the noise of the world has always drowned out, our own voice. And that is exactly what silence begins to threaten in others. Not because it is a direct attack, but because it disarms the narratives that people rely on to maintain control over how you should feel, respond, exist. Because while you speak, while you explain yourself, while you react, you are still in their field, within the emotional script they have written for you. But when you shut up, the game breaks. When you stop justifying your decisions, when you refuse to engage in sterile arguments, when you stop responding to emotional drama with more drama, you don't just stop communication, you take away their power to shape the story, the power to define who you are from the limited lens of their projections. And it is at this moment that the real panic begins, because silence, contrary to what many people think, is not inertia. It is an active force that deconstructs certainties, that destabilizes systems, that reveals what presence disguised with words. People who live in emotional control don't know what to do when faced with conscious silence. Not the kind that hides resentment or anger, but the kind that comes from clarity, maturity, exhaustion, from having explained too much, given in too much, emptied themselves too much. Because in that silence, there is something that others do not expect to find: sovereignty. Sovereignty over one's own time, over one's own energy, over one's own dignity. And that's what bothers them, realizing that you are now no longer available at any time, to anyone, for any reason. Because now, before you answer, you think. Before you surrender, you observe. Before you get involved, you choose. And this choice, this filter, this discernment, is perceived by those around you not as growth, but as a threat. Because where before there was a constant flow of attention, of validation, of reaction, now there is a void, and this void forces them to look within, to face what they have always avoided with the noise of their yes. Jung said that no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the inner darkness conscious. And that is exactly what silence does. It illuminates the darkness of others, not with words, but with the absence of them. It is in this silence that masks fall, that games are revealed, that patterns become visible, that dramas dissolve, and at the same time, it is in this silence that you begin to rebuild yourself, no longer as a response to external demands, but as an expression of your deepest essence. Silence gives you back what you have been giving away without realizing it, your vital energy. And the more you get used to it, the more you realize that you don't need to win arguments, respond to attacks, or defend your existence, because all of these are distractions from the ego trying to keep you stuck in battles that don't deserve your wear and tear. The moment you choose silence, you withdraw from the battlefield, and by doing so, you don't weaken yourself. You become untouchable. Sovereignty, the return to oneself. There is a point in the process of individuation where silence ceases to be just a strategy, ceases to be a shield against the excess of others, and begins to transform into a language of its own, into a new way of inhabiting the world, more serene, more selective, more aligned with that which you can no longer ignore within yourself. Because after so much adaptation, so much concession, so much forced presence to maintain bonds that did not see you, you finally begin to understand that the center of your life can no longer be outside, and it is not a noisy awakening, full of certainties and dramatic ruptures. On the contrary, it is silent, almost imperceptible to those who look from the outside, but devastating from the inside. As if, suddenly, what was previously unbearable now becomes non-negotiable, and what previously seemed like a lack now reveals itself as intuition, asking you to return not to a place, but to yourself. Carl Jung understood that true power lies not in influencing others, but in reintegrating the fragmented soul, in the ability to gather, embrace, and integrate the forgotten, stifled, projected parts, those you left behind in the name of acceptance, belonging, conditioned affection. Because yes, for a long time, you traded authenticity for emotional survival. But now, something has changed. You can't stand empty conversations anymore. He is no longer content with lukewarm relationships. You no longer tolerate being misunderstood just to maintain a connection that, deep down, was never about you. And when this happens, when this exhaustion of the soul turns into lucidity, when absence stops being a reaction and becomes a choice, you realize that you no longer need to ask permission to exist, because your energy, which previously spread in 1,000 directions, now begins to return, to concentrate, to circulate again within you, like a force field that has finally learned to say, not here, not now, no more. And it is in this silent turn that sovereignty is born. Not as a gesture of superiority, but as the maturity of someone who has learned to protect themselves without hardening themselves, of someone who has understood that they should no longer dilute themselves to fit into spaces too small for their conscience, of someone who has given themselves the right to no longer participate in their own emotional mutilation in the name of the harmony of others. This is what sovereignty is. It is not the shout, it is the limit. It's not confrontation, it's withdrawal. It's not control, it's selection. It's realizing that you don't need to be available for everything, that you don't need to justify yourself to be respected, that you don't need to explain yourself to those who have already decided not to listen, because your life is not a court, your energy is not a bargaining chip, and your peace is no longer for sale. And whoever doesn't understand this, whoever is bothered by your absence, by your silence, by your change in posture, is revealing not who you have become, but how functional your old version was for their games. Jung said that the return to the self involves the collapse of masks, the confrontation with the shadow, the crossing of the internal desert, and only after that comes reconstruction. And that's exactly what's happening. You're rebuilding yourself, no longer with the pieces the world gave you, but with the parts you rescued from what you had abandoned in the name of the other. You begin to inhabit your own body more firmly, to occupy your own time more consciously, to say yes only when your heart is completely in the gesture. And this bothers, because most people don't know how to deal with someone who no longer needs approval. But that is the beauty of sovereignty. It scares, yes, but it liberates. Because it is in this that you finally stop being a reaction and become an origin. It is where you stop chasing after belonging and start radiating presence. It is in this that you stop being an effect and become a cause. And when that happens, when you no longer ask for permission to exist, when your silence is your signature, when your absence is as respected as your word, then you know, with all the clarity in the world, that you have come home. And this house was always you. Renaissance, the solitude of the strong. There is an inevitable moment in this silent process of returning to oneself when everything becomes quiet, not because of the absence of conflict, but because the war that was once raging within has dissolved, and what remains is a strange, non-threatening, but profound emptiness, like a newly ploughed field where, before any flowers can bloom, one must accept the silence of the earth. It is in this apparently uninhabited space that the rebirth begins. But not an explosive, visible, spectacular rebirth. Not a social milestone with fireworks and applause, because those who truly awaken, awaken in the dark, awaken alone, awaken as someone who relearns to walk on their own 2 feet, without emotional crutches, without inherited roles, without the urgency to be understood. Carl Jung said that the process of individuation requires distancing oneself from the collective, abandoning the mask, having the courage to face one's own shadow, And that is exactly what happens when you go through the loneliness that comes after withdrawal, a loneliness that, at first glance, seems like loss, but that gradually reveals its true face, a radical presence of oneself with oneself, a silence that used to frighten and that now welcomes. You begin to realize that there is a peace that only exists when you are no longer trying to prove yourself, that there is a strength that is only born when you stop trying to convince the world that you are worthy of being loved, that there is a type of freedom that can only be achieved when you decide that you will no longer accept living under the emotional blackmail of guilt or the fear of disappointing. And with that comes loneliness, yes, but not the kind that hurts, that imprisons, that humiliates. The loneliness of the strong comes, the loneliness of those who no longer sell themselves for approval, of those who do not dilute to fit, of those who do not explain themselves in order to be accepted. This solitude is not punishment, it is freedom. It is the space where you finally hear your own breathing, where you discover that you no longer need the presence of another person to feel whole, where you understand that being alone is not a lack, it is maturity. It's being able to choose who to share with, that which is no longer trying to fill any hole. And, paradoxically, it is when you become whole in yourself that you begin to attract different relationships, not based on neediness, nor on functionality, but on energetic affinity, on mutual respect, on shared silence. But until that happens, until the new connections arrive, we must cross the valley of incomprehension. You will be misunderstood. You will be called cold, arrogant, distant. Some will say you have changed. Others will accuse you of closing yourself off. But the truth is simple. You just stopped abandoning yourself. And for many, this is unforgivable, because your absence reveals wounds that were previously covered by your constant presence. Because your silence forces others to listen to your own noises. Because your new stance disrupts relationships that only worked when you were willing to hurt yourself to keep them going. But even in the face of this, even while missing what was familiar, even while hearing the echo of what you left behind, you don't go back. Not because you don't feel it, but because now you know. You know that your peace can no longer be negotiated. You know that your time is sacred. You know that your energy is no longer a bargaining chip. You know you no longer need permission to exist as you are. And when that knowing settles, when it becomes flesh, when it breathes within you as a silent certainty, something aligns. Anxiety decreases. The rush disappears. The urgency to be accepted evaporates. And what's left, finally, is you. Whole, present, unbreakable. This is the rebirth, not the one who goes back to being the way he was before, but whose will never be as it was again.